What's up, everybody? It's Hunter Bowden with Proven Fishing, and today I'm coming to you as a JR Custom Lures Pro Staff member. Use code HUNTER right here, HUNTER, for 10% off of your first JR Custom Lures purchase. Anything in the store, 10% off as long as you use code HUNTER. And also, he'll know who sent you, so then that'll help me out when I go to buy stuff. But today, we're going to be comparing Bait Plastics 142, Bait Plastics 242, and a KVD Ocho. We'll see which one has more action, and see different ways to rig a stick or an Ocho, whatever you call it, or a Senko. But JR Custom Lures, it's not called a Senko because of the name. It's called a stick. So let's get into the tank and see what's going on. First in the tank is going to be that Bait Plastics 242 JR Custom Lures stick. I have a 1/8 ounce wacky head on here, and as you notice, JR Custom Lures sticks have a lot of action as it sinks, that wobble that you want. This is in a bluegill color. Next going in is that Bait Plastics 142 stick from JR Custom Lures. This is in a Morning Dawn core shot. Last but not least, the KVD Ocho in a double-header red. Next, we're going to move on to a Nico rig. I'm putting a 1/16 ounce Titan tungsten nail weight in the head of these worms. This is the bluegill color JR Custom Lures stick in the 242. next one going in is a Bait Plastics 142 JR Custom Lures stick. With that same nail weight from the last one in the head of it. This one has a lot more action as a Nico than it does an actual stick like your Senkos and the Ocho. For Nico rigging, I'm going to have to say that I like this one probably the best. That tail gives a little bit of a whip, kind of like a shad or a fry feeding off the ground, or the bottom. Now we're going to move on to that Ocho with the same weight. I'm just taking it out of one bait, putting it in the other. And I'm putting the hook through the same spot, every single one, that little collar area. This one doesn't really seem to stand up as much as either of the others. Wants to fall, like that tail is a little bit more heavy than what I'm wanting to use it for. So this is a little bit of an additive. I just wanted to see how it'd act. I bit that 142 stick in half and put that nail weight in the very tip of it too, just to see how it would look at about 4 inches, maybe even a little bit less. Almost Ned rigging at this point with the wacky rig set up in a Nico head. But right here, oh god, I'm definitely going to have him make some more of these, and I'm going to fish the crap out of all these. I'd say that's as big as, most of the bait fish in some of these lakes. That right there, big killer, eating off the bottom. Get snagged up by a big old female fish. Let's go over what we use in the tank, starting off with the hook. A 2/0 Berkeley wacky worm or a wacky rig hook. 1/8 ounce weight on that. And then for the Nico rig, I used an 1/8 ounce nail weight from Titan Tungsten. Bait Plastics 242 JR Custom Lures stick. JR Custom Lures Bait Plastics 142 stick. And finally, Strike King KVD Ocho in the double-header red. I'll link all of these in the description below, every single color. My favorite out of all of them for the wacky rig style would probably have to be this JR Custom Lures 242 stick, and then the Nico rig, this Bait Plastics 142. That 142 has phenomenal action. I don't think that you'll get anywhere near that action as a Nico rig with anything unless you're throwing a Nico'd swim bait or a soft plastic jerk bait. Last year I used the Strike King KVD Ochos and didn't have very good luck with them. The durability was real low. Me, now coming to JR Custom Lures, I know that the durability is there. it's been tested not only by him but several other anglers that he does great work. I know if I put the O-ring on, just as I did last year with the KVD Ocho, I can last 5 or 6 casts and catch 2 fish within them. With the Bay Plastics 142, it's a little bit lower on the durability end, but as you've seen, the action will catch you fish like crazy. Maybe one cast you'll catch 1 fish, have to change your bait out, and then next 2 casts you catch 2 fish, and you lasted with that same bait. So, it's really up to your preference, but I really urge y'all to go out, look at JR Custom Lures, and try them out. Like I said, use the code HUNTER for 10% off of your first purchase through him. And even then, if you don't want to buy anything, just tune in on his live sells, or even just his live painting and live pouring during the week whenever he posts, just so y'all can see how some baits are made. I mean, you never know. You could tune in and end up liking what he does and wanting to win an auction or even just buy on a live sell from him. So thank y'all for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share it with your friends, comment anything that y'all have ideas for, and hit the notification bell so y'all get more notifications from when I post videos. Sorry about the delay from the 2 weeks of snow and whatever, but we're here now, and it's only going to get better. We have our first tournament March 20th, so we'll see y'all later and catch you next time.